Okay, very good. All right. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our second day of the annual Property Manager Case Manager meeting. I just wanted to say that I appreciate everyone's engagement in day one. I'm hoping to see similar engagement in this day two of our Property Manager Case Manager meeting. I'm Chelsea Heyman. I'm with the Maryland Department of Disabilities. We work in partnership with the Department of Housing and Community Development and the Department of Health on what is called the Maryland Partnership for Affordable Housing. So our agencies oversee a number of disability housing programs that operate statewide. This morning, we have a guest speaker from Georgetown University, Dr. Eva Rosen. I'm very excited to hear more about her presentation. She is author of the book, The Voucher Promise. This book is set in the Park Heights neighborhood of Baltimore City, and she's going to be sharing a little bit more about the book itself, teaching us a lot of information about how the general public views voucher holders, specifically in this neighborhood, and also how the neighborhood itself interacts with both homeowners and voucher holders. It's a very interesting presentation. So I'm going to go ahead and let Dr. Rosen get started because I know she has a hard stop at 11. So yeah, take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, Chelsea. I'm really happy to be here with you all today. It's always a special treat for me to talk about the work from this book with folks who are from Maryland and know Baltimore. So I really look forward to hearing your questions and comments at the end. And so today, as Chelsea said, I'm going to talk to you about some research from my book that was published just a few years ago. It's called The Voucher Promise. And the book is really about housing insecurity in the US, and then, of course, more specifically about one particular policy that's meant to address housing insecurity. And it really chronicles how this policy is experienced by the residents in one Baltimore neighborhood, and then also thinks a little bit more broadly about how the policy works across the country. So I hope today that this talk will be relevant for your work, and please do feel free to chime in at the end with questions. Okay, Chelsea, did that slide advance? You can see the next. Okay, excellent. If at any point it freezes, please feel free to jump in and let me know. So in this neighborhood in Baltimore, poor families have moved in really large numbers with the help of one of our largest federal housing assistance programs. And that's housing vouchers, of course. And vouchers were created in the 70s under the Nixon administration. They were thought at the time to be a really economically efficient tool that would use existing private housing stock to provide homes for the poor. In the 90s, the program was expanded to house, in part, the hundreds of thousands of people across the country who were put out as public housing was torn down. And as high rises and public housing more broadly were demolished across the country, we really ushered in a new era of federal aid. And this era is one that relies on the private market to provide homes for poor families. And although it's not an official goal of the program, many have also come to hope that the program could provide the opportunity for folks to move to new kinds of neighborhoods. But while the program has been shown to be a really key anti-poverty tool, it's been less successful at helping families achieve social mobility. So this book is what I call an ethnography of a policy. It explores housing vouchers, what they were originally meant to do, what policymakers have come to hope that they can do, and then what they actually do and don't do. Now, I want to set up this story about vouchers with just a bit of context, which will probably be quite familiar to many of the folks who are here today. So when we think about the history of housing policy, we can really think about three eras in which it has unfolded. And the first is the tenement slums of cities like New York and Chicago, where immigrants settled and later Black migrants from the South during the Great Migration. In the 30s, urban renewal raised the slums and public housing was created. High rises were built across the country. They were intended to sort of literally lift the poor out of poverty by providing safe, clean homes with modern amenities like running water and elevators. In this second era, we can think about buildings like Cabrini Green in Chicago, or here on the slide, you see Lafayette Courts in Baltimore. Built again to alleviate slum poverty, but actually ended up helping to concentrate it in neighborhoods that were racially segregated with high crime, not a lot of resources. And this is what Arnold Hirsch, of course, famously called the second ghetto, implicating federal housing policies as complicit in the perpetuation of racial segregation and inequality. Now, William Julius Wilson's seminal work called The Truly Disadvantaged at that time documented macroeconomic changes that gave birth to a new urban underclass. So he said that as manufacturing left the inner city, so too did the jobs and the middle class, creating a new sort of geographic and social isolation, more concentrated than ever before, with really important effects for social networks, for jobs, for educational attainment. We'll talk about how this plays out in the neighborhood that I studied. Then we have discrimination in housing practices that really persisted throughout this era, even after much of it was outlawed in the Fair Housing Act and in the courts. So for example, we can think about redlining, the maintenance of separate public housing rosters by race, which was very common. And so these formal and informal practices, some of them outlawed by that point, some of them still legal, they really played a pivotal role in maintaining racial segregation. In addition, there were a number of prominent lawsuits that found that the location of public housing was contributing to racial segregation in violation of the Fair Housing Act. And in Baltimore, of course, we can think about the Thompson case. Now, in the 90s, these lawsuits were really bolstered by theories of concentrated poverty and social isolation, and this set the stage for a huge overhaul of federal housing policy. In the following years, we witnessed the dismantling of an entire system of housing the poor. The Secretary of HUD proposed reforms at that time that, in his words, would, quote, end public housing as we know it. And over the past 3 decades, blighted public housing has been downsized and demolished across the country. Of course, public housing still exists, but there has been really a huge shift in how housing assistance is administered overall and in what direction this housing assistance is moving. So we're now entering what we can think of as sort of a third housing regime, right? One where high-rise demolition and a transition to housing the poor in the private market have really become cornerstones of the government's quest to fight concentrated poverty. And this occurs primarily through housing vouchers, which subsidize the cost of a unit in the private market, making it more affordable to a low-income family. This chart gives you just a quick sense of the scale of the transition. So by the late 90s, vouchers had become the largest tenant-based housing assistance program in the country and really far surpassing public housing in terms of the number of households that are helped through this program. Although certainly, as you can see here, there's still quite a lot of public housing. So vouchers now serve over 2.2 million households. This may be very familiar to some of you, but I'll go through it for those of you who don't know. How do vouchers work? Again, vouchers subsidize the cost of a unit in the private market. Families pay about 30% of their income in rent. The government pays the rest directly to the landlord. The landlord agrees to pass a yearly inspection. Rent ceilings are based on fair market rent. This is, at the time of this research, this was around $1,300 for a 2-bedroom. And of course, anyone earning under a certain income threshold is eligible. But really importantly, only 1 in 4 families who qualify or who would qualify if they applied actually receives any kind of housing assistance at all. And of course, in Baltimore, the waiting list is longer than the people who actually receive aid. And much of the time over the past 15 years, it's actually been closed because it was so long. Now, nationwide, 45% of voucher holders are Black. In Baltimore, that number is 94%. And I point this out because it's important for what we'll talk about in a little bit when it comes to landlords and also actually other homeowners who tend to conflate race and voucher holders as if they are one and the same, which of course they are not. Now, importantly, in 1998, the Section 8 program was renamed the Housing Choice Voucher Program. And this really reflects the importance of the policy of policymakers at the time who wanted to use it to promote geographic opportunity through residential choice. Now, policymakers hoped that housing vouchers would create opportunities for poor families to move out of distressed neighborhoods into homes of their choosing, neighborhoods that might be safer with better schools and more jobs. But a big question among people who study this topic is, do they? And we do have some answers, and most of these answers I knew a little bit about when I started this work. So when we look at where voucher holders live, there has been some improvement. Voucher holders today live in less poor neighborhoods than the kinds of neighborhoods where they lived when they might have lived in public housing. And they are somewhat less likely to live in neighborhoods of extreme poverty compared to those who don't receive any assistance at all. But importantly, by and large, voucher holders are not moving to areas of what we might call opportunity, right? So many still live in poor neighborhoods. And in addition, there are really important differences by race. So voucher holders live, Black voucher holders live in more highly racially segregated neighborhoods. Minorities are half as likely as whites to make it to a low poverty neighborhood with their voucher. What this existing research, though, can't tell us is how people actually decide where to live with their voucher, right? And what role that voucher plays in this decision. And then also, what kinds of constraints are there on those choices? So there were a few big questions that really remained unanswered for me that motivated this book. And the first was, where do people want to live and why do they end up where they do, right? So existing research illuminates all kinds of preferences, of course, that people may have about where they live, preferences related to geography, race, social networks, the role that discrimination plays. But I felt that we had more to learn about what choice actually looks like for this population within a set of constraints. So what kinds of factors get in the way of these preferences? And I also wondered how to think about this underlying theory that that sort of underpins the logic of the voucher at this time. And this is the theory that moving nearer to higher income neighborhoods really helps, to higher income neighbors really helps people in some way, right? So how are vouchers holders actually being received by their new neighbors, and what role might stigma play? And then more broadly, I wondered whether actually we should expect that a market-based program would produce different outcomes than the broader housing market already does. So lots of big questions. I'll try to say something about each one of them today briefly. And to look at these questions, I moved to a neighborhood called Park Heights to learn more about how this policy worked for people on the ground. And I first selected this neighborhood. I was looking at some HUD data to understand where voucher holders live in the city. And you can see where they lived in 2010 on this map here by all these tiny navy blue dots, or I guess they probably look black to you. And so overall, Baltimore actually has one of the higher voucher rates for large cities in the US. Around 11% of rental units across the city are occupied by voucher holders. In the neighborhood that I studied, Park Heights, it's outlined in red. It's in the Northwest. You guys probably know this neighborhood. It's even higher, right? So it's nearly 17% of rentals in this neighborhood that are occupied by voucher holders. And a third of residents here are living under the poverty line. The neighborhood is also predominantly Black. Now, I moved into this neighborhood in 2011, and I did fieldwork there for 15 months using a combination of ethnographic observations, watching people in their day-to-day lives, and then also in-depth interviewing. Now, to find participants, I began by taking addresses from the website where the Housing Authority actually directs all voucher holders to find homes. That's gosection8.com. It's actually been renamed, but it was gosection8.com. And then I went door to door in the neighborhood to actually try to find people and talk to them. So I got to know residents, their friends, their families, their neighbors. I went to family dinners, church on Sundays, right? I tagged along for all kinds of different daily errands. And importantly, I accompany families on their housing searches. And I really wanted to identify all of the different actors who were relevant to the question that I was interested in. So I ended up talking to 4 different groups. And these were the aging homeowners, who many of whom bought their homes in the 60s and 70s, the more recent influx of voucher holders, and also plenty of unassisted renters who don't, get any particular housing assistance. And then also the landlords who house these folks. And I really talked to everyone about how they came to the neighborhood, where they had lived previously, did in-depth life histories with all 102 respondents. So this gives you a little bit of a sense of the physical landscape of the neighborhood. If you're not familiar, this picture shows one of the main streets in Park Heights, lined with these spacious homes. A quarter of the homes in the neighborhood are vacant. And as you can see in this picture, actually quite a bit more than a quarter of the homes appear to be vacant. Park Heights does have one of the highest vacancy rates of the city, but if you look all the way on the left-hand side, you can actually see some flower pots on the porch. So despite the fact that half of this block appears to be boarded up, there are folks still living on that block, and you can only imagine what that must be like. So the neighborhood is peppered with these kind of gaping holes where homes have been torn down, trees and grass have really invaded the urban space. That house in the middle there has a tree growing right up through the middle of the home. Now, what happened here? Let's go back just a bit for a little bit of history. So in 1969, this picture sort of shows the Park Heights that one of the older homeowners I got to know, his name was Terrence Green. This was the neighborhood that he really found when he moved here with his wife, and they bought a home. And at that time, this was a tree-lined neighborhood where mostly white middle-class families lived. This is Mr. Green and his wife. So, of course, due to a long history of racial covenants and redlining, African-American families were, of course, not allowed to move to places like Park Heights for much of the 20th century. In the late 60s, for the first time, banks became willing to lend to Black homeowners or home buyers in this neighborhood. And back then, Mr. Green, he told me Park Heights in 1960, when I bought this house, when I bought this house, everybody in this whole area was white. There were no Black people nowhere. And in fact, the neighborhood was predominantly Jewish, which was a selling point for Mr. Green. He really loved the deli around the corner. But things changed really quickly. And Mr. Green really put this in simple terms. He said, let me explain that to you. In those days, anytime a Black person would buy a house, all the Jewish people would leave. And this is, of course, a practice known as blockbusting. This was, many credit Baltimore actually for being the birthplace of this practice. So this is when real estate agents really stoked fears that Black families were moving in, and then were able to sort of flip white-owned homes one at a time. And of course, as the Black families moved in, the white families moved out. And Mr. Green says, though, he doesn't harbor any animosity towards these white families. He said they did what they felt they had to. And you know something, they weren't wrong. They knew things were changing because we're all stuck here with homes that ain't worth nothing. This is obviously a complicated set of events here. But I point this out because there is really something that happened in this neighborhood where Mr. Green is now stuck in a situation where it's very hard for him to sell his house because of what happened and because of the way the neighborhood has changed and the property values have plummeted. So just to give you a sense of what this looks like, in 1960, Park Heights was 95% white, primarily middle class. And in the span of just a decade, this community of around 20,000 people was really almost entirely replaced. By 2010, it was 96% Black. Now, over the years, simultaneously, the neighborhood has been hit pretty hard with economic troubles, joblessness, and aging housing stock. Park Heights has one of the higher violent crime rates in Baltimore. And there's a lot of stuff going on there. So let me transition to telling you a little bit about what I found. So in the first few chapters of the book, I really look at what the program is meant to do, officially and also unofficially. and then how these goals actually play out on the ground for voucher recipients. So on the one hand, as I've mentioned, vouchers are meant to provide stable housing, and research shows that they actually do this quite well. The program improves housing affordability, it reduces homelessness, it alleviates overcrowding. And I tell the stories of folks who don't receive any housing assistance at all, right? And it's quite clear how much worse off these folks are compared to those who do receive vouchers. So one woman who I met, Destiny Stevens, she lives in what's called a room for rent. So she shares this one room with her husband and her 2 children. They carry their own roll of toilet paper to the bathroom, and they share that bathroom with 3 other adults who live in the house. And Destiny has been on the voucher waiting list for a number of years. I also met Tina Jackson, who moved to Park Heights with her 13-year-old daughter when she lost her home in East Baltimore because she couldn't afford to repair the roof. This was a home that her family owned, and they actually lost. And now they share a 2-bedroom apartment, but the complex that they moved to has a lot of drug selling going on. Tina feels like it's really dangerous. She's afraid to go outside. She's also been on the Section 8 wait list for years. Now in chapter 3, I tell the stories of people who did receive a housing voucher and the ways in which it really changed their lives for the better. So people describe this like winning the lottery, which of course in a way it is, because the voucher program, the vouchers are allotted based on a lottery, right? So Vivian Warner, one woman I met, was able to move off her sister's couch, and in getting that stable home, she was able to regain custody of her kids. Tony Young is a 55-year-old man with HIV. He was able to move out from under the bridge where he had been sleeping into a 1-bedroom apartment with heat and electricity. And with the stability, he was able to then take his medication more regularly. Joanne Jones was a mother of 2. She was able to start shopping at the natural food store where she could buy fresh fruits and veggies for her kids. Now, however, many policymakers, of course, have come to hold a secondary hope for the program, that it might provide choice and get people to new neighborhoods to create what we might call mobility, social mobility, different kinds of mobility. Now, on this second goal, it's really not doing quite as well. So in chapter 4, I tell the story of I tell a story that helps to illustrate this, right? So one of the women I met, Edie Baxter, she's in her 50s. She was born in public housing in the Flag homes, and she moved out when she was a teen. She really bounced around to a lot of different homes, many of them pretty poor quality, many of them in dangerous neighborhoods. She got on the wait list, the Section 8 wait list, when she was pregnant with her first daughter. And by the time she received her voucher, her daughter was actually 8 years old. But despite this wait, Edie was really thrilled. She read up on all the rules. She learned she could use it basically anywhere. She was really excited to move to the county, right? She had always dreamed of living in Owings Mills. She wanted to have more trees around. But when she got the voucher and she went to visit these homes in the suburb, landlords turned her away sort of one after another and just said, we don't take vouchers here. Now, that being said, the voucher nevertheless really did change her life. It offered her stability, better quality house. She doesn't have to worry about where she and her daughter will sleep. But in the end, she didn't have a ton of say in where she ended up. And I think that's important to note. Okay, so in the next part of the book, I start to look at why people don't have as much choice as we might hope. And there's a bunch of previous research that has really looked at the role of limited affordable housing, right? The housing supply itself. Where are affordable homes located? What kinds of neighborhoods are they in? On the other hand, there's been research that also looks at residential preferences and information, right? Positing that people maybe end up in the segregated neighborhoods they do, perhaps because of choices that they make or preferences that they have. And so these are sort of 2 competing viewpoints, right? But what I found was that there was a really missing piece here in between these 2 forces, right? A key actor who shapes both the supply side itself, but also can sort of influence tenants' decisions and preferences even. So someone related to both supply and demand, and that is landlords, right, are a really important piece of this puzzle, somewhat understudied. And while there has been recent work looking at how landlords play a role in, for example, eviction, we still know not that much about the role that landlords play in selecting tenants in, right? How they make decisions about who is a good tenant, who has a desirable set of characteristics, and then learning more about the role that landlords play in actually sorting renters across neighborhoods, into neighborhoods across the city. So what I quickly realized was that I really couldn't tell the story about voucher holders without understanding the role that landlords play and telling their stories as well. And so one landlord I met, David, he actually goes and stands outside the Baltimore voucher office to recruit tenants on their way out the door. So on any day of the week, you can find landlords like David who are waiting here, offering to drive tenants up to their vacant units, offering incentives like customizing the paint color or waiving the security deposit, even offering move-in cash bonuses to voucher tenants. Now, they do this because voucher tenants have become quite desirable in this neighborhood. And you might be saying, wait, I thought landlords were discriminating against voucher holders. And of course, that is what often happens more broadly. But what happens in this neighborhood is a little bit different. So in disadvantaged neighborhoods like Park Heights, finding and attracting tenants who are able to pay their rent reliably is often not very easy for landlords. So kind of a basic fact for landlords, certainly in Park Heights, but often in other neighborhoods in Baltimore as well, is that there are a lot of low-income renters who really can't afford to pay their rent. And what this does is it provides an incentive for landlords to entice voucher holders into these units because a big chunk of their rent is being paid very reliably by the housing authority. So one of the landlords I spoke to, Oscar, he explains, he says, everybody, and by which he means landlords in his particular market niche, it's not really everybody, but he says everybody prefers Section 8. It's tough times now. If the tenant doesn't pay the mortgage, you have to. Section 8 ensures that you're going to get your money. So by assuring reliable rent, this program really appeals to a certain segment of landlords who have now oriented their businesses towards attracting and retaining voucher holders. They also do it not just because of this reliable rent, but because sometimes they can actually get a premium above market rate. So in a neighborhood like Park Heights, landlords report that they can get several $100s more from a voucher holder than they could get from a market tenant. Or I had one landlord who had two identical units in an apartment building, and the one rented to a voucher holder went for, I think, $300 more than the identical unit rented to a market tenant. Of course, this is not how it's supposed to work. And I'm sure we can talk about it in the Q&A, but in practice, it does often work this way. Now, this set of practices, waiting outside the office, offering these move-in bonuses, falls into a category that I call targeting tactics, right? That landlords use to entice tenants to their properties in neighborhoods like Park Heights, where they would otherwise have trouble attracting tenants. And this results in something that we can call predatory inclusion, right? Where voucher holders are really not making full choices about where to live, but rather they're sort of being lured into some less than ideal neighborhoods where they might not otherwise end up in many cases. Now, at the same time, more broadly, of course, there is this exclusion from more affluent neighborhoods. And this is what we hear more commonly when we think about the voucher program. We think about folks like Edie who are being shut out of more affluent neighborhoods, discriminated against in those areas. And outside of Park Heights, of course, the program is highly stigmatized. Landlords frequently discriminate against voucher tenants. Now, some landlords are outright racist, others know that their tenants are, and they worry about, upsetting the neighborhood, the neighbors, and so they won't accept voucher holders for that reason. Most cities and states don't have adequate legal protections for voucher holders. There is, of course, no national source of income discrimination law preventing a landlord from discriminating against a voucher holder. There is, of course, one now in Maryland, but when I was doing this research, that law was not in place. Now, because landlords' motives are aligned with their own bottom line, not necessarily with the greater good or with the goal of the voucher program, This is why we see this dual trend of inclusion on the one hand in more disadvantaged neighborhoods, and then exclusion on the other hand for more advantaged neighborhoods. And together we can sort of see how these two trends really do contribute to patterns of segregation, whether that's racial segregation, economic segregation, and to some of the sort of overarching patterns we saw in the kinds of neighborhoods that voucher holders are able to move to. And due to all this, right, lack of legal protections for voucher holders more broadly, the persistence of racial discrimination and voucher discrimination, even in areas where we do have source of income discrimination laws, the role that landlords play, I think it's fair to say that this idea of choice among voucher holders is sort of a bit more of a goal, of a fictional goal, than it is a reality at this point. The potential is there, but sort of a full set of choices is not realized because of the role largely that landlords play. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the receiving neighborhood, right? The neighborhood itself that that voucher holders are actually moving to. And one of the ideas used to justify the transition to the voucher program is the idea that neighborhoods matter for life outcomes, right? So in contrast to public housing, where people had no choice at all but to live in the neighborhoods where public housing was located, right? And these were neighborhoods with not a lot of resources. For the most part. As I've mentioned a few times, policymakers have really come to hope that voucher holders might be able to access different kinds of neighborhoods, and in particular, that they might be able to access different kinds of neighbors, right? People who might connect them to jobs and resources that they might not otherwise have access to. And this is what we call social capital, right? Social capital is the set of tools and information that your social networks can impart to you. And given Park Heights' history as a largely homeowning community, we might actually expect that existing residents have quite a bit of resources to impart to newcomers. And because it's a predominantly Black neighborhood, there might be less racial animosity than we might expect from a receiving neighborhood that was predominantly white. But interestingly, I didn't really find this to be the case, right? So when I looked at the neighborhood receiving context, the social dynamics between old-timers and newcomers, the way in which the voucher was really stigmatized by existing residents, what I saw was that homeowners weren't really letting voucher holders into their social networks. They were actively excluding them in many cases. So what this says to me is that mere proximity to social capital wasn't enough, right? Park Heights is a neighborhood that's actually quite fragile in many ways. So the homeowners who moved there, again, as we saw with Mr. Green and his wife, they were victims of predatory housing schemes, redlining, blockbusting, and they're now quite understandably protective of what little they have left, and they perceive voucher holders to be a threat to their home values. We can talk about whether or not we think that's actually the case, but certainly that is their understanding of what it means to have voucher holders arrive to that neighborhood. And then what's more, I think importantly, community organizations aren't always bridging this divide. So while there are a number of community organizations in the neighborhood, there are sort of improvement associations, right? Healthcare groups, community groups, they tend to mostly serve homeowners and renters quite separately. And so they sort of reinforce these differences rather than helping to bridge them. All right, so lastly, I do want to tell you about one thing that I think is a really key feature of vouchers. So one of the women that I got to know, Vivian, she moved to Park Heights with her voucher. And I mentioned before, with this stable home that it provided, she was able to regain custody of her twin boys. Vivian always really liked her neighborhood. She said that she felt safe there, especially compared to some of the places where she had slept when she was homeless. But towards the end of my time in the neighborhood, Vivian's husband was killed in a street mugging. And at that time, she decided that she wanted to move. And she told me, I just want a new place to live. I just want to feel safe. Now, the voucher was actually the thing that really allowed her to do this. So without the voucher, she likely would have been stuck where she was. And this flexibility to move and, whether it's to escape violence, to escape a traumatic incident, to move for a new job, to move maybe to get your kid to a new school where they might have a different or better experience. I think this flexibility is something that, middle-class families frequently take for granted. The voucher holders that I got to know felt that their voucher was really liberating in this way. So even if from the outside we can see all the ways in which choices are really quite circumscribed, I think it's also important to hear people when they say that the voucher really changed their lives, that it provided them with choices that they never had before. And so there really is this duality, right, between looking from the outside and seeing all the ways in which the program could do better and hasn't met some of its goals in terms of providing a full set of choices, but at the same time, really listening to people when they say, I never got to choose where I was going to live before, and I did with this voucher. Okay, so in conclusion, this book is really about the important role that neighborhoods like Park Heights can play in life outcomes, but also I think the under-examined role that housing policy itself plays, right? It's a story about how a federal program that was in many ways meant to address some of the failings of public housing is in turn repeating some of the same problems of housing policies in the past. That said, the policy provides homes for millions of households, and it has the potential to do more. So with some key reforms, I think vouchers could work better to reduce the undue influence of landlords in the process and to provide families not just with a roof over their head, but also some choice in where they live. So I'll talk just for a minute about some of the policies that I think could help make this a reality, and then we'll open it up for questions. So first, vouchers, as I said, do really tremendous work to keep people stably housed. And the program should be expanded to everyone who needs it. This is something Biden has proposed in his housing plan before he took office. We have not seen it come to fruition, and I'm not sure that we will, but this is something that I think expansion could really help to reduce stigma around the program. It would be something more familiar to landlords, and could reduce that discrimination. It could even push developers to actually build and create more affordable housing. But really importantly, and I talk about this in the conclusion, if we were to just scale up the program without addressing some of the flaws, I think we would see those flaws magnified, and we would see the harm that they do, of course, magnified. And so I think it's really important to think about what levers we have to sort of tweak the program and make it better before we talk about just expanding it. So most importantly, I think we need to shore things up on the tenant side, right? To mitigate landlord influence, which is, as I mentioned, not always in the tenant's best interest. So we should provide more information, more counseling to families about where they can move. There are programs like security deposit assistance, transportation for housing searches. These kinds of things would reduce the power of landlords to actually be influencing tenant decisions and empower tenants to move to the places that they most want to. There are also some policy-wide changes that I think could and should be made, such as extending time limits, right? The period of time that's allotted to the voucher holder to use their voucher. Housing authorities across the country are making exceptions and giving people, extra time to make these decisions. And yet huge proportions of voucher holders end up having to return their vouchers to the housing authority because they're unable to find a place to live within the allotted time. And so extending that time period is really crucial. Expanding source of income protection laws. We talked about this, and source of income laws, protection laws are not cure-alls, but the research shows that they tend to make small but significant differences. So they do open up opportunities for tenants, and they do encourage landlords to be less discriminatory, even if they don't prevent all or even most discrimination. I think that using source of income protection laws in combination with small area FMR laws policies can be really effective. So small area FMRs essentially calibrate rents at a more local level. So they eliminate this premium that I talked about in neighborhoods like Park Heights. And this is, of course, if you take Baltimore as an example, Baltimore City is a relatively low-income city surrounded by extraordinarily wealthy areas, right, in the Maryland suburbs around the city. And of course, the FMR, the fair market rent, is an average of rents across that entire metropolitan area. So if we set the rent ceilings at this entire metropolitan, at the level of the entire metropolitan area, then landlords are going to be receiving a premium relative to what rents are in a neighborhood like Park Heights, because it's being averaged with areas that are quite a bit more wealthy. And so when you calibrate rents at a more local level, this is something that happens in Washington, D.C. It's called neighborhood-based FMRs. We see that landlords have a little bit less incentive to sort of recruit voucher tenants in poorer neighborhoods. And they actually are properly compensated for accepting voucher holders in more affluent neighborhoods. We can talk about what that would actually mean in Baltimore. It's a little bit more tricky, and then finally, I do want to highlight some limits to the voucher system. So vouchers don't work for everyone, and this is perhaps especially relevant to the folks in this room. There are families who are going to need additional housing support and who aren't prepared to go out on the private market and find housing on their own. And that either means that they need additional counseling or caseworkers, or it means that they might be better off in a different housing environment like public housing. I also think it's important to note that investing in tenant-based solutions doesn't mean we don't also have to invest in neighborhoods themselves, right? So place-based investments should be happening in tandem with vouchers. Park Heights is a perfect example. Vouchers are not going to transform the neighborhood. They're not meant to transform the neighborhood. They can help people get to the neighborhood, live in the neighborhood, afford the neighborhood, but the neighborhood itself needs resources as well. And that's something we need to think about more broadly. Okay, with that, I'll stop there and I'll let you all jump in with questions.
Great. Thanks. Thanks, Eva. That was a great presentation. Very informative. So if anyone has some questions, I would like for people to put those in the Q&A. You can put them in the chat as well. Or you can raise your hand. Any of those options are good. And if not, I can ask questions as well. I have my own questions, but I'd like to hear from the audience if anybody has anything. Okay. Where can we buy your book?
You can find it on Amazon. That's probably where it's cheapest. It's usually on sale on Amazon. You can also listen to it on tape if you want. They have an Audible edition of it. I'm not the one who reads it, but probably whoever reads it is better than me at reading it.
Audible. Yeah, so I did actually, when I sent out the invite for this session, everyone, there is a link to the Amazon page where you can buy Dr. Rosen's book. And I can also put that in the chat though, as well. So that way you guys have access to it. Let's see. Okay.
Oh, it looks like there are 2 hands.
Oh, okay, great. Let's see. Who do we got? Lakeisha. I'm allowing you to talk.
Hi, good morning. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, hi.
Okay, awesome. Thank you, Ava. Awesome presentation. So I just had a question regarding your research in HUD. I saw on your website, it looked like some of your research had been funded by HUD. Have they considered, implementing any of the recommendations that you've made into the program?
Yes, and I will say I can't take credit for most of those recommendations. There have been lots of folks who have studied this over the past few decades. I talked about small area FMR, this notion of calibrating rents at a more local level. That is something that was implemented. It was initially proposed by the Obama administration. It was supposed to be implemented by the Trump administration. It was not implemented. It went to court and then it was implemented. So there are 16 or so cities across the country that do set the rent ceilings at a more local level. There has been quite a bit of research looking at, does that have the effect we hope? Does it have any unintended effects? And it looks, we're still studying it, but if you take DC as an example, it looks like since they changed the way rent ceilings were set, families have moved to new neighborhoods that they weren't living in before. So if you guys are familiar with DC, the way it works is like if you have a 1-bedroom voucher in DC, that voucher, if you want to use it east of the river, in Berry Farm, which is where there used to be a big public housing development, that voucher is worth about $1,700. If you want to use that same voucher in a neighborhood like Georgetown or Foggy Bottom, that voucher is actually worth $3,000. And that is a huge difference. It reflects the way our housing market actually works. It is much more expensive to live in a place like Georgetown. And the idea is that if you want to live in a neighborhood like that, you should be able to. It I think really does help to make those rents more calibrated to what the costs of living in either of those two neighborhoods actually is, while still allowing people the choice to live where they want. So that's one policy that has been implemented. It has not been implemented more broadly, but there certainly is hope that it may be. There has been a lot of interest at HUD in the last few years in thinking about how to motivate landlords to participate in the program. And some of the subsequent work that I've done after this book is really about learning from landlords directly why they do and don't participate in the voucher program. So HUD actually currently is doing a big study to look at some of the incentive programs that were developed by local housing authorities across the country during the pandemic to incentivize landlords to participate. So everything from like an insurance program to try to help landlords feel more confident that if something goes wrong, there will be an insurance pool to help them, or those calibrated rent ceilings that I talked about, or even direct cash incentives to encourage landlords to participate. And so they're actually systematically looking at which of those incentive programs work and with what kinds of effects. So definitely there is a lot of work being done at HUD to try to really evaluate which of these programs would be most effective. I think like anything in the world of housing, you hit up against the problem of there not being enough money to implement everything that is shown to work. And so that's always going to be a challenge, but I do think the research is really starting to systematically look at what works and what doesn't work. Thanks for the question.
No, that's awesome. Thank you.
All right, Chris, I see your hand is raised.
Yeah, I just had, it's a brief question. I live in far Western Maryland, so there is not a lot of diversity in our area. And I'm curious, I haven't looked into it at all, but maybe off the top of your head. So how do the vouchers pieces work? Like, how is it broken down? It doesn't seem to be systematic. Like, we have a lot of people on vouchers in the county I live in. And I'm thinking Baltimore City alone has 100 times what we have. So I mean, we're kind of successful, I think, that getting people on the voucher system and quickly, but like, I hear that like waiting lists stop taking people even in Baltimore City. And I don't think that we have that situation happen for us. So can you like elaborate, like give me like a a teeny bit of education real quick on the different areas, because I'm not familiar with Baltimore City and County and Montgomery or any of that.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it's not just Baltimore City, it's across the country. Wait lists average, close to 10 years in some places. And like you said, it's actually very hard to manage a 10-year long waiting list. I mean, the people on the list are not even going to be at the same address or phone number or email that they gave you when they initially signed up, right? So it actually becomes an incredibly difficult task to manage those wait lists. And as a result, they often just close because they figure, well, taking more names on this list isn't going to help anyone. It's actually going to make it harder to manage. And that's true in many cities across the country. I mean, oddly, it sounds, if I'm hearing your question right, one of your sort of underlying questions is, how does one place have this number of vouchers and that place have a different number of vouchers? And how does that correspond to the actual need that exists? And unfortunately, there's not a ton of rhyme or reason here. It's not like if you have more need, you automatically get more vouchers, or everyone, gets the number of vouchers proportionate to the number of people they have. Then basically vouchers are administered through what are called housing authorities. There are a couple thousand housing authorities across the entire country, and housing authorities are totally separate from other kinds of government entities. So they're not attached to cities or states. The city of Atlanta has, I think, 12 different housing authorities. Baltimore just has one, but then the county has another. And of course, in theory, you're allowed to take your voucher from Baltimore City to Baltimore County or to San Francisco if you want. But actually doing that can be really tricky. And so the sort of burden of this local government structure that's not neatly mapped on to any existing structures ends up creating a lot of administrative burden for people who want to move from one place to another. And then whether or not a place actually gets more vouchers when they need them doesn't really have to do, again, with need. It has to do often with how well that housing authority is managing the vouchers that they have. So if they're able to use all of the vouchers that they've been given in one year, HUD might be more likely to allot them more in the next year. And so housing authorities get sort of rated on how well they're doing in that way. But unfortunately, that allocation is not really related to need. So there are cities that that have far greater need than others, and that need is largely unmet.
Okay, we have one question in the Q&A. What percentage of vouchers in Baltimore are not used because of the time limit not met?
Yeah, so I don't have the exact number for Baltimore, and part of the problem nationally too is that HUD has actually not released data on this question since 2001. But if you look at the HUD data from 2001, which is the last data we have nationwide, it's something like a third of voucher holders end up returning their voucher. Now, if you look at really tight housing markets, it's even higher. It's close to 40% of voucher holders that are failing to use their voucher and returning it to the housing authority. In more loose housing markets like Baltimore, it's a little bit lower, but it really is a substantial portion of folks who are unsuccessful at using that voucher. And so we are very much in need of some new data on how this is happening in different places across the country.
Great. Kind of a related question that I had. So one of the things that your book talks about, and this affects obviously voucher utilization, is the inspection process that comes with, a tenant using a housing choice voucher in the community. What are your thoughts on that? Like, do you feel like there are ways that the process could be made more user-friendly for landlords and tenants? And what do you think that could look like?
Yeah, so in the research that I've really been working on since finishing this book, again, it really is sort of from the landlord side. And one of the main things that landlords say about their participation in the voucher program is that the biggest barrier to their participation is not what we might expect. We might expect that it might be their worries about the tenants. It turns out it's really more to do with their interactions with the housing authorities, and specifically they cite this inspection process as a really frustrating process where every time they get an inspection, the inspector finds something different that's wrong that they didn't find last time, and then it's a new thing the next time. And on the one hand, of course, it's very important that these units are properly maintained and that voucher holders are living in places that are up to health codes and all of that. On the other hand, it seems that the inspection process is so onerous that a lot of landlords are getting deterred. So one of the incentive programs that has been studied by HUD, as I mentioned in the last few years, is the possibility of changing the inspection process a little bit for landlords who regularly pass every inspection every time, perhaps moving that inspection to once every 2 years instead of once every year. And so they're definitely considering playing around with that process a little bit. I happen to agree with you, Chelsea. I think that's probably one of the most important ways in which we can help landlords be a little bit more open to renting through the program, is by lessening that burden a little bit while still making sure that these homes are safe and habitable.
Absolutely. Well, I know you have a hard stop at 11, so I really appreciate your time today. Do you have time for one more question, or?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay. Susan, I've unmuted you.
Yes, hi. One of the questions I had is when you find landlords that kind of like in an apartment complex that have a section where they put their voucher clients. Like I've noticed that that's one issue, and the other issue is I've found that with some of the support planners that I work with, the clients that are looking for housing, the voucher is not meeting the rental amount. Are there any things that are put in place that could help, since the market has changed, especially since the pandemic, that these housing prices have risen, but the vouchers are not going to be able to get them into a place?
Yeah, that's a great question, Susan. And you're really pointing to why SOI protection laws are quite limited, is because it's very easy for landlords to say, well, let me just price this unit just a little bit above the price ceiling, the payment standard. And then it's very easy for me to turn away this voucher holder without actually technically discriminating against them. And so it's certainly a tool that landlords use to get around those kinds of laws. And or they designate, as you said, some portion of their units in a building to rent to voucher holders. And then the rest of them they price above that ceiling. Unfortunately, there are not a lot of tools. The budgets that housing authorities have not been increased just because housing is more expensive. And so that is sort of a central challenge in our country, is that housing prices have risen while the budgets allocated towards funding affordable housing have not risen and actually have declined in relative terms. And so I think you're pointing to a huge problem that we don't currently have a solution for, but great question. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dr. Rosen, for your time. This has been great. I'm so glad that we were able to get you presenting to the group, and lots of great questions. So yeah, thanks everybody for participating. Hold tight for the next part of our agenda. We're going to have a facilitated conversation. Marianne Graham from the Department of Health will be talking a little bit about the psychological impacts of transitioning to the community. So I'm hoping that we have a lot of good engagement from the audience. We'll take a little break, like a 5-minute break, and then we'll come back around 11:05. But thanks, Dr. Rosen. Hope you have a good rest of your day. Thank you.
Thanks for all your questions. Take care.
You too. All right. So thanks everyone for sticking on for the second half of this morning's presentation. I'm really excited to introduce my colleague, Marianne Graham from the Maryland Department of Health. Many of you are probably already familiar with her, but this part of the presentation is going to be focused around supporting tenancy in the community. So a lot of attendees today are either supports planners, case managers, and property managers, of course, working with tenants as they transition into Section 811 units or Weinberg units in the community. And when somebody makes any kind of move, it can be not only a stressful experience for the person, but it can also present them with, all kinds of new experiences, a new community. And so making that shift is something that can really be jarring for an individual, even if it's a positive change, right? So even if they're moving out of an institution into their own apartment, it's a positive change, but it comes with a lot of new things that people have to get adjusted to. So Marianne, I will go ahead and let you take it away.
Thanks, Chelsea, and good morning, everyone. So this is just, a brief slide show. I didn't do anything major because I really want us to have more of a conversation regarding these issues, but I also wanted to bring a little bit of information to the discussion. So as Chelsea was mentioning, it can be quite difficult for people when they transition to the community. Obviously, it's something that is very wanted, but it may be something that has been very challenging for them to bring about. So one of the things that case managers need to be aware of is what are some of the challenges that people experience. And I'm sure all of you have had a lot of experience with that. So I look forward to hearing, your thoughts during our discussion. Okay. So as we know, transitions can be challenging. In a study by Robeson et al., they discovered that most challenges vary significantly depending on what group the person is in. So whether the person is an older adult, whether the person is someone with a physical disability, whether someone has a mental disability, or could be all three. And that challenges they found were associated with the transition or the length of the transition period for at least one of the groups. And they recommended that case managers pay particular attention to consumer engagement and housing challenges, as those were some of the areas that were the most challenging and caused the most delay in terms of people being able to transition from the institution to the community. And their study recommended targeting people for return to community earlier in their transition stay. And in fact, the study found that that most individuals who leave the facility do so within 90 days of admission, and then that transitioning for after longer stays is much harder. So, that really has an impact in knowing when you're going to be working with someone, starting from the very beginning, and if they identify that they want to transition, to really make sure that you're getting that information and working those processes as much as possible sooner. Okay. So another study which focused on people with psychiatric disabilities, they found the following themes. So a big theme was social isolation. And again, these were folks with psychiatric disabilities, and they discovered that the psychiatric disability stigma, the stigma related to people's perception of people who have psychiatric disability, was a big piece of the social isolation. And that also because of the stigma and because of maybe some of the behavioral consequences of dealing with a psychiatric disability, that people had experienced social network depletion. So in other words, they had strained relationships with families and friends, and maybe even had lost relationships, and were having difficulty then renewing those relationships once they moved out into the community. And again, having limited social opportunities, possibly due to where they were having to live or their living situation, which was also impacted by a lack of financial resources. So, could be that someone had to take whatever housing they could that was subsidized, but it was far from their usual social network. And then because they didn't have enough money to be able to get back to spend to get back to visit those folks, that was an issue. Another theme was participating in virtual community. So to try to make up for some of the lack of social networks physically and in the real world, people were attempting to use the virtual community, but that can be challenging as well because due to lack of skill in terms of using technology, the ability to purchase the technology to use. Not everyone can afford to have a smartphone or a tablet or a computer, and then having to navigate in the community if they're going to use places like libraries, where they could use a computer for free, but barriers may be in the way in terms of learning how to use that technology. Another theme was the variability of their impairment experiences. So some of the people with psychiatric disability had situations where they might be hearing voices or talking, and so people were hesitant to interact with them, or they were hesitant to interact with other people because they could never predict when they were going to experience the visual or auditory hallucinations. And so that impacted their ability to connect in the community. And then finally, needed community supports. So many of the people found that it would have been helpful to have personal assistance services, but because of the way things are set up right now, it's personal assistance services is easier to obtain if you have a physical disability as opposed to a psychiatric disability. Finding peer support networks can be difficult. And again, dealing with changing public perceptions of people with psychiatric disabilities. So given all these challenges, I'm hoping we can have a discussion around how case managers and supports planners can assist their clients in connecting to the community. What do you need to support your work with clients in the community? And what successes have you experienced with transitioning your clients in the community? So I invite people to put information or put questions in the chat or the Q&A, or to unmute yourself and just kind of share. So do we have anyone who would like to share some of their experiences of transitioning their clients into the community and what the issues that they may have faced? So I know one thing, having been a case manager, even though it's been a few years now since I had an active caseload, one of the things that I experience with my clients in terms of assisting them to connect to the community is, when you're actually looking for housing, and, as Dr. Eva mentioned in her presentation, people don't always have as many choices in terms of where they can use the voucher based on the fair market rent and that kind of thing. But to a certain extent, you can explore that with your clients to try to help them really think about where might be the best place, and thinking about what their social networks are and how to make sure that they are close to, or as close as they can be, given the options for their housing. So what other ways have people found to be able to assure that their clients are connecting to the community?
Okay, looks like Stacy raised her hand. I'm gonna allow you to talk.
Thank you. Stacy Tobin with Southern Maryland Center for Independent Living. One
Stacey?
of the ways that I have been finding some help from my consumers who have been lucky enough to get a voucher or to get supports is working with our interdisciplinary team. So they're getting assistance with the departments of social services in the 3 counties that we work with to help them be more attractive to landlords by offering support, helping with maybe a double security deposit, or helping work with them to get just that backing to be able to help the landlords feel that they're a good risk for them. We have closed voucher lists on and 2 of the 3 counties, but in St. Mary's counties we've had a lot of support, and working with those interdisciplinary teams has really helped some of my clients actually get into some of the programs through How to Live 811 and actually through the voucher program as well, to get this extra supports they need to be able to finalize the process to be able to support the transition. So
That's great.
Just if you don't already work with your DSS, work with if they have interdisciplinary teams, get on those teams and work with them to help as a community of agencies, help some of these people get into housing and get into a more supportive community.
That's a great suggestion. And, I think you're right. We can't underestimate how much just the fact that a client has a case manager, somebody that can intervene, what that means for landlords, because I think that they really appreciate having somebody that they can work with to address any issues or concerns that come up. So,
and I work with all of my HUD 811 clients. When we go through the leasing process, I go with them and I have them sign me as one of the people that the landlords can reach out to if there's a problem with late rent. I just this week had a landlord reach out to me about a client that's fallen behind, and I had to reach out to him and say, hey, what's going on? Why are you 3 months behind getting ready to be evicted? And we were able to, he had fallen on hard times and just didn't know who to reach out to. Didn't even think, hey, let me call Stacy and see if there are any supports. And, we were able to then reach out to Department of Social Services and some local programs that are able to help him catch back up, because it was just a one-time situation, that happened. He fell on a hard time. He's living on SSI. And so they're going to be able to help him with the back rent that's due, and he can show that he can then continue to remain sufficient and support himself going forward. So I just make sure that, even though once they get into that apartment, I'm still a point of contact. If there becomes a problem, the landlords know that they can reach out to me to help support them, with lease re-signing, or if they do fall on a struggle on a hard time, that there are programs out there that can help, that they don't think to reach out to me for.
Right. And I think that that's really great. And I think that you're right. It's hard for clients sometimes to recognize, hey, I can ask somebody else about this. So one of the things that's important during the housing assessment, or just assessment in general, is figuring out, how much assistance does this person need? Some clients you can say, okay, go here and do this, and they're fine to go and do that on their own. And others, you may have to do a little bit more hand holding and checking in with
Absolutely.
them. So
And our
great.
job doesn't end when they move in. You know what I mean?
Right.
There's the lease re-signing. There's problems that come up, a year down the road, and sometimes they forget that we're still working with them. We're still their active case managers, even though they've finally gotten into their place, that we can continue to help them.
Right.
And connect them to resources that they don't know are out there.
That's excellent point. Excellent point. I see someone in the chat Chuck is saying that he agrees. I agree, Stacy. Follow-up is often key. Also, providing resources to community programs such as furniture vouchers is one example. Yeah, that's a great point, Chuck. Keeping in touch with people and finding out what it is that they need and helping them to obtain that is very important. What about other folks? How have other folks assisted their clients in connecting to the community? One thing that I know that oftentimes people need once they've actually got their housing is, regular food source. Some people, were able to access SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, and even small amounts could be helpful. But one of the things that I often would connect my clients with were the food pantries in their area that they could go to either on a monthly basis or on a weekly basis. And those are actually opportunities to connect to the community as well, because sometimes people, after using those resources, would actually return and volunteer there. And it was a way for them to build their community. What are some other ways that you may have used to connect your clients to different resources?
Okay, it says in Carroll County, I found many are not familiar with Carroll transit systems. Introduction to transit is a game changer. That's what Chuck was saying.
Yes. And transportation is a big issue. Okay. Yep. And Susan, thank you. You're saying there are a lot of faith-based organizations that have food pantries as well. That's true. And that could be a real source of community for people if they are able to engage. But transportation is a big issue, and it's one that we have found can really impact the people's enjoyment of their housing situation. If they're able to get around easily, that's great. And areas where people are having more difficulty getting around, it makes them not necessarily as successful in that community.
Yeah, absolutely. Community churches can also assist with utility and rental assistance as well. Nikita Dixon said in the chat.
Mm-hmm. Very true.
Another resource, and like Marianne, it's been a while since I've done any case management for people, but another resource I would commonly refer people to were community action centers, although I understand that they're not always super accessible at times, but they do screen people for things like utility assistance and other benefits programs.
Mm-hmm.
There's also, if I'm going to type this in the chat, there's also an organization called Benefits Data Trust, which is another entity that screens for different kinds of program eligibility, like SNAP and I believe also utility assistance, and it's done through a call center.
Okay. And Robin is saying, we have a few women aging in place with no family members who have major health problems, physically and mentally. What resource would you suggest to help them in Baltimore? Great question. So, oops, sorry, they're coming in so quickly, I'm missing some. So in answer to Robin's question, one of the things I wonder is, are they connected to home and community-based services program? I know it's a long waiting list for the community options waiver, but sometimes people are eligible for community first choice, which is the state plan, and there's no waiting list for that. And so that could be, you know, part of the solution if they are able to qualify for that and receive some in-service, in-home services that would help with some of their physical needs. Unfortunately, with our mental system, there's not as much support, but there is some support out there and resources. One of the things, the study that I mentioned, the second study I mentioned that looked at the 4 themes, was actually in conjunction, it was in Connecticut, but it was in conjunction with some of their centers for independent living. And that can be a resource for people as well, for people with disabilities. And they often have peer support that may be able to work with people and at least kind of help build some of that social network. And I don't know, do other folks have ideas for Robin?
I just sent her I put this in the chat about Civic Works, the Hubs program, and
Okay.
that's Baltimore City, and then Baltimore County's program is called Because. It's through their Office on Aging. So the programs do the same thing, but they are run through different entities depending on where you are. If the person has significant challenges, though, one of the things that, like, again, I mean, I also hesitate to constantly recommend this to people, but you know, it might be necessary that the person get and Marianne, you can correct me if I'm wrong, is it AIRS evaluation? AIRS, yeah, assessment. So, you know, you want to make sure too that if there is a situation where you think that the person needs something like that, making that referral when and if it's appropriate, particularly if there's no family members involved, the person can be very vulnerable to being taken advantage of, unfortunately. So.
I'm just adding to the chat through the AIRS assessment can be accessed through the Maryland access point.
Yeah. Also, it looks like, let me see, sorry. Susan says, also before transitioning to the community, the case managers can check to see what transportation services are available in the areas their client may be moving to and have them apply for mobility, county ride, etc.
Very good point.
Yeah. And Amy says a listing of various resources will be helpful to access when assisting clients in the community.
Right.
Yeah, and I mean, honestly, I don't feel as if people access 211 frequently enough. There's a lot of attempts to kind of consolidate resource lists, like in many, many different ways. But if you're uncertain about what is available, I definitely encourage you to use the United Way website to look up information or refer if you have a person you're working with that is particularly independent and wants to do that research by themselves, tell them, what's available and have them do that work. It's important for, independence, and it's also allows a person to make choices, right? So that's like the whole idea behind community living and behind these programs.
Mhm.
And Marianne put the link in the chat.
Yeah. Okay. So what kind of support do you, as case managers, supports planners, people working with clients, what do you need to support your work with clients in the community? What do you feel like in your ideal world would help you to do this work? Obviously resources, but what other things? And again, feel free to answer in the chat or to unmute, or if you need assistance unmuting, raise your hand. Again, when I was case management, and even now, I wish in my ideal world, I wish we could wave a wand and just have housing appear. And I live in Baltimore City, and so some of the pictures that Dr. Rosen was showing are very familiar to me in terms of abandoned houses, and there's certain sections you drive through, and if I could wave a magic wand, all of those houses would be fixed up and available for housing our low income and homeless population. It's so frustrating. I find it personally frustrating to see all this housing stock that has just fallen into disrepair that could potentially be homes. And so, staying engaged with policy is very important, and knowing what's happening in your local area. But what other ideas? Okay, so Ruth is saying sometimes we may need to become a little more creative and suggest that persons rent a room until they're able to obtain an apartment. Very true. Very true. And seeing what kind of roommate situations there are. And sometimes, we have an idea in our mind about where we want to live and what we want to do, but they don't necessarily match up with the circumstances that our clients are dealing with. So helping them kind of explore some of those opportunities and being creative is important. Has anyone worked with someone who, moved from being socially isolated to being socially connected in their community? And what did that look like? We got a quiet group today.
I can throw something out there. And mind you, this is like over 10 years ago. So when I was working specifically in employment services with people with disabilities, one of the things that really was a life-changing moment was when the people I was working with got jobs. It was a situation where, not only did they have some extra income to work with, but they also felt really connected and felt a sense of purpose through their employment. It was really like a life-changing thing. And even if it's working a couple hours a week here and there, it was enough where people really felt like this is where have a source of pride. I can, show that I'm skilled enough to do this work. So I think that jobs, getting connected to job opportunities is a big game changer to feeling connected to community as well.
Mhm. I agree. Lisa put in the chat that in addition, one can contact adult services via the local DSS office or through 211md.org. Very true.
Looks like Chris has her hand raised. Chris and Sean.
Okay.
Chris first.
Okay. I was trying to type it, but I'm really slow at typing. So I'm in a weird situation where I work primarily with people with intellectual disabilities. So we have the developmental disability route. So a lot of times we're providing like in-home supports for someone. So you see a whole difference when somebody has independent housing on their own outside of their family or outside of a living unit with like, the 24-hour supervision kind of thing. And it blossoms. So every single time it blossoms. So there are some learning curves. There's definitely like a transition needed for like to gain confidence for the person. So it'd be neat to have some sort of stepping stone, just to get that confidence without that safety net that they've had their whole lives. But and it's helpful to go over, some situations where, try and have some of your guests out by a certain time frame. I mean, so we look at a lot of the housing roles and the reasons why they're helpful, just for safety reasons. But yeah, it's been like a game changer for many of them. So where you have that paid provider trying to create those connections, here you have like the community at large seeing somebody living in their neighborhood and they want to be neighborly and they want to reach out. Now, again, I live in a very rural area compared to some of the city situations. So people are noticed, but it's been very empowering and for everybody involved. So,
That's
I
really
love
great.
it. I love the independent housing pieces. I wish we did way more of it.
Well, that's really great to hear. That's great feedback to hear. I think that, as you can see someone blossoming, it really just renews you as a case manager as well, to kind of see that positivity. Unfortunately, sometimes we don't see all of that. So it's good. Thank you for sharing that, Chris. And Chelsea, I think you said someone else had their hand raised.
Yeah, Sean Spencer, I did allow you to talk. You can unmute yourself. Yeah, be able to. All right. I'm asking you to unmute Sean, so I don't know if it's working on your end. There's a comment from Chuck in the chat. As I personally received a voucher, I got a job as a disability advocate helping others apply for vouchers as well and support them as needed in the process I just stepped through. That's awesome.
That's
great. Ideal. Yeah.
That's really great because that, as you know, I'm sure that process can be very daunting, especially if someone is not used to working within that system. And so that's really great that you were able to do that. I think peer work is so important.
Yeah, often the people that are the experts are the people with disabilities themselves, obviously. And so, part of it is really, I mean, honestly, there's so much benefit to be had through engaging peers in this system. And I think that they can support, very much so other people's transition because they know exactly what that is like. So they're going to know, okay, this might benefit the other individual is moving into the community. They might benefit from this service or resource because it benefited me, right? So that's a really great observation.
Right. And actually, in terms of resources, that's a great way that people can find out about resources as well, in terms of, just within peer-to-peer or neighbor-to-neighbor, one person learns of it and then passes it on and lets other people know. And so the actual communities themselves, kind of disseminating that information is really important too.
Yeah, it's that social capital that Dr. Rosen was talking about. It really is. I mean,
Right.
it kind of, it does make a huge difference when you have people moving into areas where there's like a welcoming, level of social capital. And I think that part of the role of people working in case management is to guide, not necessarily to dictate, right? So, you're guiding the people that you're supporting and working with to what makes sense for them. And so, I think that that's where when you see someone empowered enough to make their own decisions and you're not, involved in that at all, and they're positive and helpful decisions, it's like, it's really, really inspiring, I think, and beneficial. So
I think so. Yeah, I think that the listening piece is so important. And, as a case manager, I really tried to listen more than I talked, and to really get an idea of what it was that my client wanted, because people are going to do what they want to do. And, you can support them, and you can point out when you think a decision is not necessarily going to be helpful. But again, nobody knows as well as the person. So.
right.
I think there's one question in the Q&A. Okay. Tamuel, sorry if I'm not pronouncing that properly, asks, what is the process when a client that is already in the HUD 811 program wants to transfer to another part of Maryland? Oh, this is a good question. So, right now we do have a transfer policy that is related to a reasonable accommodation request. So it has to be related to someone's disability, and a request can be made, and it will be evaluated by the Maryland Partnership for Affordable Housing. All of our members, we have what we call an exceptions committee that meets. So we usually try to review it and provide an answer. I believe it's within 10 days, right, Chelsea?
I think it's 14.
Okay.
I
Sorry.
want to say it's 14.
Didn't mean to shorten the time.
No, it's okay. I'm second guessing it and questioning it, but yeah.
It's in our tenant selection plan, which I don't have right at my fingertips right at the moment. So
I can put the link in the chat for you guys.
Okay, that would be good. And that outlines the process for requesting a transfer. Unfortunately, because we do have units all across the state of Maryland. However, well, in some ways it's really good. We have a high occupancy rate. But what that means is that when people request transfers, there can be quite a long wait, because unless there are active new properties coming on, which right now there are not, and actively leasing up, that means that we're waiting for somebody else to move out. And so, the process can be quite long. So if someone is interested in moving, they should be looking at all of their options. And we encourage people who are in HUD 811, as with any program, I always encourage people to look at all their options, but keep an eye and regularly check in on your Public Housing Authority web presence, web page, to see, because sometimes they do open up the lists If you're in a county where the list is open, then I encourage you to have your clients put themselves on the wait list. Or assist them in getting on the wait list. And if you're in a county or a jurisdiction where the wait list is closed, I highly recommend checking very frequently, at least once a month, to see whether that list is open, because sometimes they open for very short periods of time and people can be added. But it's not something that they advertise widely. So you kind of have to keep checking, and your clients have to kind of keep checking. Okay.
Yeah, one of the things too, I'm just going to throw this out there. I'd also really evaluate when you're working with people whether or not the transfer is something that, again, is related to their disability or just related to personal preferences. So, one of the things that, and we really try to encourage people to take a look at the community that they're moving to. Does it actually make sense for them to move there? Because as was pointed out in the chat, there's a huge delay in terms of if somebody wants to transfer for a disability related reason, it has to be a disability related reason or a household size change. The wait is significant. So if, someone is moving to a place where they don't have easy access to their healthcare professionals, or like they know that the unit does not meet their needs in terms of their disability. I understand certainly there's a lack of affordable and accessible housing. So I do empathize with that. However, it may be worth talking to your client and saying, hey, does this actually suit you? Is this going to be a place that you would feel welcome and that you'd want to live long term? Because it can be a significant delay if they decide, oh, this unit does not meet my needs and I need to leave. In addition to, I'd say, this is where you want to have a dialogue. If the issue is accessibility, if the person finds that the unit does not meet their needs accessibility wise, what can be done to the unit, like modifications that could be done to the unit that could make it that it's more accessible for the person to use. And that's where I think too, like the community integration piece is really important, because oftentimes people want to transfer because they don't feel connected to the place where they live. I found that has been true many, many times. And there is going to be a transition period for the person where they're going to be grappling with a new place, possibly having to find new doctors, possibly having to navigate a new transportation system. And that's where the independence piece, and that's also where the person getting acclimated to community is important. So, really work with your client and say, is the move something that is prompted by the feelings of psychological distress of transitioning to the community, or is this a move that is necessary for the person, based on their disability and based on what their needs are? Because there is a distinction, right? There is something that, when you're working with the person, they're going to go through a transition phase and they're going to need that connection to those resources. And could resources help with being that connection, or do they absolutely have to move? So that's where I think, we get a lot of transfer requests that are really related to the person not being, not feeling integrated in the community. And that's not really a reason for someone to move. It is a reason for someone to get more connected to services, more connected to what is out there that maybe they're not even familiar with because they're new to the place that they've moved, right?
Right. And that's a really great point, Chelsea. Yeah. And Stacy stated in the chat, it's important to remember not all areas have comparable resources or programs. That is very true also. But making the the most of what you have in your area is really important. But again, like Chelsea was saying, having that conversation up front prior to the person moving in is really important because unfortunately, like ideally, everybody would be able to move easily and we would have enough housing stock where it wouldn't be an issue. But unfortunately, we're constrained by the realities of our situation now. So
Yeah, definitely.
does anyone else have any successes that they'd like to share that they've experienced with transitioning? It'd be nice to end on a positive note.
Good morning, everyone. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can, Sean. Thank you. Yes, go ahead.
This is Alicia Williams. Can you hear me?
Oh, hi, Alicia. Sorry, your screen name says Sean.
I
Yes,
have no
we can
idea
hear
why
you.
I'm coming up as Sean. That's my colleague.
Ah,
Good morning,
interesting.
everyone. I was earlier this year, I have a client that I've been working with almost 5 years now. And as long as I've known her, she has been living in a 2-story like apartment where she lived on the top floor, not handicap accessible at all.
Mhm.
And she just had to walk up a mountain of steps just to get upstairs every day. And she is someone that goes out into the community every day and goes to a day program. I was able to move her. She is a Section 8 participant, but I was able to get her apartment through the Section 811 program. And she's at the new building, Renaissance Row.
Oh, great.
Handicap accessible. The transition process was fairly fast. And it just brought her into a space where she's more comfortable now. She does like the fact that it is handicap accessible. They have a gym inside the building. They have internet access. They have family room, an activity room on each floor. She's very friendly, but she's a person that has lived and been alone by herself for so long. So she's used to shutting people out and just being alone. So this has kind of brought her out of her shell a lot. And I'm happy for her. Just a new chapter in her life. We just got her new furniture and everything's just coming together for her. So that is my success story for 2022.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing that. It's so nice to hear that a transition went fairly smoothly and, you know, and that the person is happier in their place now. Wonderful. Okay. Chris put in the chat that said, I really want to help more people to purchase some homes of their own. The area we live has inexpensive housing and many times a mortgage would be cheaper than rent. I haven't supported people to do this nearly enough. Yeah, I mean, that would be ideal. And I know that for some people in the Housing Choice Voucher Program through the public housing authorities, there's also a program in conjunction, at least I know in Baltimore City and Baltimore County. I believe that the other housing authorities have it also. It's called the Family Self-Sufficiency Program. And it does work with people who have a voucher to prepare them for home ownership. And there's a savings component to it as well, which I don't know the details of that. But if I remember correctly, it was that they encourage people to work. And as they work and their the rent changes, because you know it's based on the person's income, instead of that change going to the landlord, it gets matched and put into a savings account, which the person can access after a certain period of months. So if you are able to, I encourage you to contact the local public housing authority to see if they have that program and to find out if that would be something that, you know, could help people in your area. Okay, great. All right. Any other success stories or thoughts about transitions and, you know, the psychological impact that they can have on people? Well, I want to thank everyone for participating. Oh, someone is at Chuck is asking the name. It's called the Family Self-Sufficiency Program. I'll put it in the chat. Oops.
There's also within DHCD, there is a program, a home ownership program for individuals with disabilities. It serves a very limited number of people because of their funding. You know, it can only go but so far, but it does help with mortgage like with down payment assistance. And there are certain income requirements that the person has to meet. So it's for bit higher income population than certainly than, you know, who we're working with through 811 and Weinberg. Let me see if I can go ahead and pull that up. I believe it's called one moment, sorry. It's the Homeability Program. So if anyone has questions about the Homeability Program, we've had the administrator for that program has done presentations for us in the past. I'd be happy to invite her back if there's any questions. I linked to that in the chat as well. And there's also the independent living tax credit. And that is more so to finance home modifications for an individual with a disability who is a homeowner who needs, like, you know, ramps installed or things of that nature. I'm going to link that in the chat too.
Mm-hmm.
1 second, sorry.
Is that the, Chelsea, is that the program that also helps with weatherization?
No, it's a different program. So the Weatherization Assistance Program is separate program. It would be something that if an individual was interested in applying, they would have to go through their local Department of Housing and Community Development for Western and Eastern Maryland. That's still going to be, and Lakeisha can correct me if I'm wrong, I believe that's still DHCD, the state DHCD. But the Weatherization Program is something that is available for individuals who are at, I believe it's 200% of the federal poverty level. Mm-hmm. It is something too that can be accessed. We mentioned earlier the community action centers, 211, some of those general like resource lines. They can assist somebody in getting an application in for that. I'm gonna go ahead and just link the Weatherization Assistance Program criteria. I will put that in the chat. The LIGHT program, Joanne, that's Baltimore City only. But yeah, so for Baltimore City, it's called the LIGHT program, and it's like a central intake for weatherization, housing rehabilitation, and like lead paint remediation services for eligible moderate to low income households. But in other jurisdictions, it's not called the same thing. So I'm going to put a link for the Weatherization Assistance Program in the chat. The DHCD website is pretty much covers, you know, what you would need to know. There's a specific page here. I'm going to put the local weatherization agencies. Here's a link to all of the local weatherization agencies throughout the state, which is on the DHCD website. Okay.
Oh, great. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
All right.
Any other questions? We are at noon. So if there are no other questions, I think that we want to thank everyone for participating in this discussion. Hope it was helpful. Obviously, Dr. Rosen's presentation was very helpful and informative. And we thank you all for joining us for this 2022 Property Manager Case Manager Annual Meeting.
All right, thanks everyone. And for those of you who have registered for both last week's session and today, I will be sending out an email and I'm also going to be uploading these recordings. The presentation from last week, I did get a copy of those slides, so I'll send those out. Dr. Rosen's slides will not be available, but you can certainly view this recording on YouTube. I'm going to put this up on YouTube for people to view, and any like supplementary materials that we talked about today. Okay. All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a good rest of your day.
Take care, everyone.
Bye.